Hey, good evening, everybody. Like Roberto said, my name is Bolt Otter, and I will be telling you a little bit tonight about Bolt CMS, the CMS we've been working on. Myself, I've been working as a professional on the web for about 23 years now. I'm the founder of a web agency called Two Kings from The Hague, and in this talk I will first give a brief history of Bolt up until now. Then I will talk a bit about where we currently stand and where we're going, and I will also give a demonstration of the installation and some of the features of what we're building. When I started working on the web, I think it was 1996, like anybody else, I was convinced it would be a good idea to build my own CMS. A lot of people did this back at the time, but most of the people were smarter than me and just decided to use Plone or Joomla or whatever was hip at that time. I'm a bit of a stubborn bastard though, and instead of switching, I persevered in building my own thing. It started with a fairly simple CMS for my current employer at the time. The code was quite terrible. All the files had names like viewpage.php, and every single file started with includes header.inc.php, stuff like that. I was working on this, I think, somewhere between 1998 and 2000 or something. This is a screenshot of what it looked like. As you can see, it's basically just a simple tree view and a bunch of input boxes, and that's about it. The first open source project I worked on was called Pivot. This was a basic blogging tool. Everything was actually stored in files on the server because at that time databases were considered to be a premium feature. So a lot of people who had shared hosting couldn't use databases, so instead we had to store everything in flat files. This is a screenshot of the first version that we had. The code itself was actually quite horrible still. Everything was procedural, and the screenshot is a bit fuzzy, but you can, if you look careful, make out the announcement of the Pivot Users web ring. Back in the early 2000s, there was this thing that people had a web ring where you would put this little thing on your page and you could click to previous and next, and you could link together a group of like-minded people. And so we had this cute little thing where every Pivot user was connected in this little web ring. That's how old this is. The next major version was called Pivot X. By this time we had moved to Subversion, so we actually were using a version control system, and there were also some classes to be found in the code, so it was getting slightly better. After a while, we reached a point where Pivot X was starting to show its age. This is around 2012. I was looking around for frameworks to base the next major release on, and we were considering using Symfony 2 or CodeIgniter or Kohana. And in the summer of 2012, I went to SymfonyCon in Paris, and there I was introduced to Silex. Silex is the micro framework that was basically the smaller brother of Symfony, and what I really liked about it is that it has a really low barrier of entrance. It's really easy to get started with it, and it allowed us to structure the project the way we wanted to. So pretty soon I decided to start using Silex for the next major version. The initial name we chose for this new version was Pilex. Basically it was a contraction of Pivot X and Silex, and I thought, hey, Pilex sounds cute. This was a bit of a mistake though, because there already was a product on the market called Pilex, and yes, that's hemorrhoid cream, or aanbijen in proper Dutch. So, okay, that name had to go, so we chose Bolt instead. This is what we picked back then, and so far we're sticking with it. And this is basically what I and a bunch of other people have been working on since then. This is a screenshot of the first version of Bolt. Back then I was actually pretty happy with what it looked like, even though nowadays it still looks very outdated. The source code, because it was based on Silex with a bunch of Symfony components, was a lot more structured than what we had before, but still there was a bit more to improve on. In the second version of Bolt, we made a bunch of those improvements, and actually the user interface started looking quite a bit like what it does currently. And here we have version 3 of Bolt, and this is actually the current stable version of Bolt. This, the way it looks, has remained pretty much the same since about May of 2016, when Bolt 3.0 was released. In the meantime, we have done about 30 maintenance releases, and currently we're at Bolt 3.6.11. But not long after 3.0 was released, we started thinking about where to go with the next major version. Back then we were still on Symfony 2.8, and we were thinking about, should we upgrade to Symfony 3, or should we hold out and wait for Symfony 4 to arrive, or what else? While we were contemplating this, I went to the SymfonyCon in Cluj in Romania, and you'll never guess what happened there. During the opening keynote talk, Fabien Potentier, who is the lead developer of Symfony, he was telling about the new features that would arrive in Symfony 4. After a short while, he got to the point where he was telling about what this would mean for our beloved Silex. And basically, there you have it. There would be no support for Silex in Symfony 4, and the EOL, or the end of life, was announced. So at this point in time, it wouldn't make much sense to base the next version of Bolt on Silex. So basically, Silex was dead, and we had to come up with a different plan. We had to figure out how exactly to phase out Silex, and two major options came to mind. The first is to iteratively upgrade to Symfony 4 and the Flex. Basically what we would do is we would rewrite one part of the project at a time to keep the entire project going. Meanwhile, we would be working towards the goal of eliminating Silex altogether. Or alternatively, we could go for a global refactoring, basically scratch the whole thing and do a total rewrite to make a fresh start. If you've ever had any software engineering classes, you probably know that global refactoring is always considered to be a terrible idea. There's a ton of articles online about why this is such a bad idea. I have a few examples here. For example, Joel Spolsky, well-known developer, he has an article on his website where he said they did it by making the single worst strategic mistake that any software company can make. They decided to write the code from scratch. And there's this guy at the Adobe Tech blog, and he's saying about it, it typically is a bad idea. It brings with it high risk and a high rate of failure. And finally, there's this guy who is basically patting himself on the back for having the wisdom to abandon a total refactoring halfway through, and instead to go back to their previous code base, so they kept working on that. I'll give a few reasons why exactly total refactoring is considered to be a bad idea. The first is that it always takes longer than you expect. Even if you double your estimates, it will still take about twice as long. Secondly, if you do a total refactoring, you will seize the opportunity to fix your old mistakes, but at the same time, you will inevitably make a bunch of new ones to replace them. And you will be replacing old technology by new stuff, cutting-edge technology. But the problem is that the cutting-edge technology that you pick today might again be outdated or legacy crap 1 year or 2 years from now. And finally, and this is perhaps the most important one, if you do a total refactoring, it's a huge setback for your project or for your product. You will have no features for your existing users for a long time, because you'll be spending the time on basically rebuilding the stuff you had before. And this is often a very hard sell for your clients or your project managers. So, because we are rational people, we decided not to do the total refactoring, but instead go for the gradual refactoring, because that's the only thing that makes logical sense. So we started working on doing that, and that went well, right? Well, actually, no, it was a huge clusterfuck. There were a large number of problems we encountered along the way. First of all, over the years we had been reinventing the wheels. Instead of using off-the-shelf components and libraries, we often would use something that we built ourselves, or use something that was old-fashioned, and sometimes even a bit of the not invented here syndrome snuck in, where we decided we would do something ourselves instead of using something that was readily available. This meant that gradually our code base had become quite complex and hard to manage. Every new feature that we were building cost significantly more time as the project grew. Basically, the complexity grew exponentially. And this in turn resulted in a decline of external contributions, because there were a lot of people who wanted to contribute to the project, but as soon as they started reading into the code, they found out that it was very hard to do so. The barrier of entry was really high. And finally, there is no one-on-one mapping for a lot of things between Silex and Symfony 4. Features like router collections or services or dependency injection, they really work quite differently in how they worked in Silex and in Symfony. So after about 9 months of working on that, we discovered that not a lot of progress has been made. In fact, if anything, the code base had become more complex during the transition, because the project was trying to be two things at once. It tried to be both a Silex application as well as a proper Symfony app. And as a result, basically, it was neither. And then at one point, a former core team member remarked, "The code for the storage layer is incredibly complex. I'm probably the only person in the world who understands it." And when he said that, I thought, yeah, you're probably right. And I thought, wait, that's not something to be proud of. In fact, it's the exact opposite. So this is basically a visual representation of where we were at that point in time. I was then remembered of another famous quote: "Don't cling to a mistake just because you spent a lot of time making it," by Aubrey de Graaf. This is also known as the sunk cost fallacy. Basically, the misconception here is that people make rational decisions based on the future value of their investments and experiences. But the truth is that your decisions are often tainted by emotional investments you accumulate, and the more you invest in something, the harder it becomes to abandon it. Still, sometimes that's the only way to go. So on one Saturday morning, a little over a year ago, I ran this command on the command line and I started coding again. I did this knowing full well that it meant that we would put a freeze on the new features for the current Bolt version. I was fully aware that of all the reasons that people always give to not to do this, but in my opinion, it basically was the only way forward to force something new to happen. Doing this also gave us the chance to rethink how to structure Bolt 4. First of all, it had to be professional, it had to be solid and professional, so that editors, implementers and developers alike would actually want to use it. Therefore, it has to be well built, using modern PHP and proper front-end code. It has to be extensible, so that we can grow the ecosystem again and that people can build custom projects on top of Bolt. It also has to be maintainable, so that we can keep up with new developments, and also that we can make sure that new features can be added without exponentially raising the complexity of the project as a whole. And finally, and this might sound trivial, we need a good out-of-the-box experience. This basically means that people should be able to easily set up a Bolt installation and try it out without having to spend a lot of time configuring stuff or poking about, or basically even having to know anything about how it works before they try it out for the first time. As you'll undoubtedly have guessed by now, I chose Symfony 4 to start working on. There's a few reasons why I chose Symfony 4 over other frameworks. First of all, it's really fast. Because of the optimized router and the cache container, the overhead of the framework is really quite minimal. In fact, it's quite a bit faster than Symfony 2 or 3 were, and in fact, it's even faster than the micro framework Silex ever was. Symfony makes a lot of use of auto-wiring and annotations, and these concepts are often seen as detrimental to the quality of your code, because people say that comments are not code, or auto-wiring is slow and it makes the developer lazy. And at first I didn't like these concepts either, but after a while I really grown to like them. And I will show you an example of how we use these in Bolt in a little while. The default structure of a Symfony project is really nice and straightforward. And I really like this because this makes it fairly easy for a novice developer to find their way if they first start using a Bolt project, or if they first start using Bolt itself. We benefit from this in two ways, both for when you're tinkering with Bolt itself, but also when you create a project on top of Bolt. The structure is very similar, and very similar to the default Symfony 4 structure. And finally, this speaks for itself, I think. The documentation for Symfony is really good. The community is very good. There's the Symfony Casts website, which has a lot of tutorials for Symfony, and the project itself has a very good vision on long-term strategy and the versioning of the project itself. And this brings us to the current status of Bolt 4. So right now, Bolt 4 is in beta. This means that a lot has been done already, but it also means that there's still a bunch of stuff to do. A lot of features are not finished yet. Some features are not even implemented at all, but in my opinion, that's fine. We took quite a long time to get to the point where we are right now, and so we're doing it properly, and we're taking our time to build on this solid framework to make the CMS that we actually want to use ourselves. We're keeping track of the development in our roadmap. You can find it on this URL. This is not set in stone. Actually, we're quite pragmatic about it. Sometimes we shift stuff around if we decide that something needs a higher or a lower priority. And then we'll get to the probably my favorite part of this presentation. I'm gonna do some things live, and well, you know how it goes. Stuff might break, stuff might fall apart, so it's fun. Anyhow, I'm going to show you a bit of what we've been working on so far. Okay. Okay. So basically, I have a blank terminal, and what I'm going to do to set up a Bolt, I'm going to run the composer create project command. And what this does is it does a checkout of the project from GitHub and installs all the dependencies. Composer. Oh no. Oh, where did my cursor go? Okay, there we go. Oh. Hey, something weird's happening. See? There it goes. Why is it not? Why am I not seeing what I'm typing? Okay. So, and it needs to have a empty folder, of course. Okay, so now that I'm running the command successfully, it's doing a checkout of the project from GitHub, and it's gonna set up all the dependencies, all the vendor packages from Packagist. Then it's also going to copy over the templates and the assets. And one of the things I wanted to achieve here is that to set this up, you don't have to muck about with npm or node to build a JavaScript. Basically, it's all done for you. So the next thing I'm going to do is, let's see here. I'm going to go into the project, and I'm going to run the command to set up the database and the first user. I'm going to do this by running the Bolt setup command. And so now it has created the first user for me. And while it's doing, after it's done this, I can now create the first user, give it a secure password, set up an email address, give it a username. Now that I've done that, it's adding some fixtures to the database, basically some dummy content, so that we actually have something to look at when we first open up the website. And right now it's fetching some images from Unsplash so that we have some nice pictures to look at. And now this is done. So basically we have set up Bolt, and now all we have to do is start a web server and we can start using Bolt. You can basically use anything for this that you want, Docker or MAMP or Apache or the PHP built-in web server. I like to use the Symfony command line tool because it's very easy to use. So I'm just going to do Symfony server start. Now it has set up the web server, and I can just click here to open this URL. And what you see here now is basically what you get when you install Bolt out of the box. Thank you. Basically what you see here is what you might expect from most CMSs. We have a home page where stuff is being shown. It has some other things, and there's some listings of different content types, and if I click on one of them, I will go to the listing page of that content type, and if I click here, I go to a detail page where we can see some more information about this specific page. There's a built-in search box, and it searches through the database, and it's not very fancy, but for most use cases it suffices. So that's the front end. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to log into the back end of the website to show you what that looks like. No. Okay. I'm gonna log in using the password I just added, and here we go. This is basically what you get out of the box if you install Bolt for the first time. On your left hand you see the main menu with the content types. These content types are basically a way to structure your content, because for example a news item might have different content than, for example, an annual report. And using the content types you can keep those together, but you can also define what type of fields are available for each of these content types. In the middle part of the screen you see the last few records of content that were added, which is of course the the dummy entry, the fixtures that we've added, and on the right hand side you see some widgets like the latest Bolt news and an informative widget that tells you the weather. It's a bit silly, but I like adding it because it's nice to show something trivial like that. If we edit one of these pages, you'll basically get a screen like this, and if you've ever used any CMS, this will look fairly familiar. There's a number of different types of fields you can use. This is like plain WYSIWYG-like fields and normal text fields and image fields, and if I want, I can use this to upload an image. So for example, if I grab an image here and I drop it here, and now if I save this page and I go back to the website, you'll notice that it has replaced the actual header on the website. One of the new features that we've added in Bolt 4 is built-in multilingual functionality. Right now, by default, it just added all the dummy entries in English, but I can switch to Dutch. And now if I type here, oh no, if I go here and I type, for example, Nederlandse titel, and I save this. Now if I go back to the front page of the website, you'll notice that there's a language switch here, and I can just switch to Nederlands, and you'll see that the Nederlandse titel has appeared here. Basically, this makes it very easy to make multilingual websites out of the box. Another thing that we've been working on is the multimedia or the media management library, and it's fairly simple, but still I think it's quite nice. Basically, it allows you to see all the files you've uploaded either as a list view or as a card view, and if I click on one of these, I can edit a bunch of metadata about this file, like what the title is. I can add a description, but I can also use it to keep track of the original copyright holder, and you can determine where the initial cropping is made. And finally, I wanted to show you the extensions. Hello. I mentioned before that one of the goals for Bolt 4 is that we want to make Bolt very extensible. And one of the things that we've done this is by making it so that extensions are actually regular composer packages. And later on I will show you how you can actually make one or install them. But for now... Oh! I am... Okay, yes. I will go to my profile. And in my profile, I set it to English and store it. And now it should be in proper English again. Okay. And then let's go back to the presentation. Oh, and okay, so both in the front end as well as in the back end of Bolt, we use Twig as a templating language. I really like Twig because it's very expressive and semantic. This allows us as developers to actually do quite a lot with it, but also it's very well liked by template designers and implementers because it's actually quite semantic and easy to get into. And here's an example of how we leverage that inside Bolt. Most templates have a so-called record or main piece of content assigned to it. And under the hood, this is actually a doctrine entity that we've added some extra goodies to. This will allow us to do stuff like record.title or record.author.username, and actually it gives us the output that you would expect. But at the same time, you can dump this record and you will get a full dump of all the attributes and the properties that this record has, so you can inspect them for debugging. The next thing I want to show you is how we're putting in some effort to make this really nice and friendly for the end user. For example, normally If you have a record which is a doctrine entity and you would want to get something from it, you would have to use get field to get the field, which is another entity, and then you would get the value from that, but in this case it's a scalar, so we can't just output it because it's not formatted as a twig string, so twig tries to escape it, so we have to pass it through the raw filter. And this works, but you'll have to agree that just using record.title is much nicer and a lot more friendly looking. It's also a lot less error prone, and it allows novice developers to get into the system much easier. And the cool part about this is that even if you dump this record.title, you will still get the entire field entity with all the properties and attributes that are assigned to it, so you can still debug it. The last twig tidbit I wanted to show you is some of the other nice additions that we've made. You can use this set content tag to query the contents of a site using a straightforward syntax. Then you can use the for tag to iterate over this array and just output them one by one, for example using the page.title. And below that you see a few new additions that we've made, the so-called extras or magic attributes. These work on all content types regardless of their definition. For example, the excerpt will always show a small summary of the records, and the thumbnail will always show a thumbnail of a image that's in that content type regardless of what you've named that image inside your content type. And the page pipe next will always link to the next one in the array regardless of what it's called. Earlier I mentioned auto-wiring annotations and how much I've grown to like them over the time. Here you see an example of how we use them inside Bolt. This is basically the entirety of the controller class for the extension screen that I've just shown you. At the top we have the constructor, and it has the extension registry service auto-wired. I can just do this and store the extension registry and then use it later on. The index method has a simple annotation for the route. This is literally all you need to make this route work, so that if you go to /extensions, it will know to use this controller and it will output the correct template. It knows both which URI to respond to, in this case extensions, and we've also given it a name so that we can use that to actually create URLs to this controller by using the name. So, and I think that's really nice because it's really short and concise. And next up I want to show you a little bit about how you can actually extend Bolt, how you can write your own code to integrate into a Bolt project. For this we've also made extensive use of the nice features that Symfony provides for us. So I'll go back to the demo. Let's see where my cursor is. Where did my cursor go? Okay. Okay. Go away. This is the structure of that project I just created. If you've ever used Symfony 4 before, this will look quite familiar. We have a bunch of folders. One of them is the config folder that has all the regular Symfony configuration, and a special folder where we have the specific configuration for Bolt. For example, here's the content types that I referred to earlier. There's also the public folder, which is basically the web root. This is what you point your web server at, and this has basically the index.php and only the files that need to be accessible through a browser. As you can see, all the code and all the things that should not be accessible are outside of this web root, which means that they can't be accessed in a browser. And there's of course the vendor folder, which has all the composer dependencies that were previously installed for us. And finally, most importantly, there's the SRC folder. this is the default folder where you can put your Symfony code. This is set up to be auto-wired, it's set up to be used as services. So basically this means that we can put our code in here and Symfony will know what to do with it. So for example, if I want to create a small extension to use in that Bolt project I just created, all I need to do is, no, don't do that. Go away. So what I need to do is just create a new file and create a new class. And in this case, I'm gonna just call it class called foo. And now I need to do two things to actually make this recognizable as an extension. I need to extend the base class and I need to implement two methods so that Bolt knows what to do with it. So I'm just going to extend the Bolt base extension class, and I need to implement a getName method which needs to return a string, and so this can just return hello null team PHP, and I have to create another method called initialize, and this doesn't return anything. Usually this is the method you would use to initialize your extension. Every extension in Bolt runs this method, and here you can set up widgets or twig extensions or event listeners or other stuff that you need to do with it. But for now, this is the bare minimum that we need to actually make an extension. If I save this file and I go back to the command line, I can show you. If I run the console command and list the extensions, you will see the dashboard weather widgets and the news widgets that you've seen before on the dashboard, but there's also the new extension, the hello null team PHP that we just created. Like I said, this extension doesn't really do much, so I'm just going to briefly show you an extension that actually does something, and it's actually a regular composer package. You can find it on packages, but I can install it and Bolt will recognize this as an extension. So if I'm just gonna install this is called the reference extension, and it doesn't do much except for just easily show a few of the nice things that we can do. There we go, it's finished installing, and if I list the extensions again, then you will see that there's a fourth one, the reference extension has been added. If I go back to PHP Storm, I can show you that it's been added to the vendor folder, and the main code of this extension is in extension.php, and you'll see that it's actually pretty much like the one I've shown you before. It has a getName, which returns the name of the extension, and it has an initialize method, which in this case does something. It registers a widget and it registers a twig extension. If we'll take a look at this twig extension first, if you've ever written the twig extension, this will look familiar because it's literally a regular twig extension. There's nothing Bolt specific in here. The only thing that's Bolt specific is the way it's initialized. What this does is it adds a filter called rot13 with a callback for the rot13 method. This method takes a string, it passes it through the PHP string rot13 function, and it returns the result of that. In case you don't know, rot13 is a very secure encryption algorithm. What it does is it transposes all the letters in the alphabet by 13 places. So the A becomes the M, the B becomes the N, the C becomes the O, etc., and the other way around. It's very secure. So, but it's nothing fancy, but it's nice for illustration purposes. If we go back to our extension, we also have a widget that's initialized, and in this widget you see that there's actually no code in here, just it sets up a few defaults, a few variables, and this will actually tell Bolt where to actually put this widget, in this case on the dashboard in the aside, and it sets up a template that's used with this widget. If I take a look at that template, there's nothing fancy in here, just a few divs and a few twig tags. It outputs the extension name, it outputs the description of the extension, and it outputs the description again, only this time passed through our Rot13 filter. And so this is basically what we need to set up an extension that works. And I'm just going to show you what it actually does. If we go back to our extensions page, here you'll see the reference extension was added and also our extension that we just created. They're both listed here. But if we go to the dashboard, then we can see it in action. Here we see the widget we just added. It has the name, it has the description, and it has this description again, only passed through our secure Rot13 filter. So that's basically everything that's needed to create an extension in Bolt 4. The final thing I want to show you tonight is tell you a little bit about how Bolt can be used as a headless CMS. On the left of this diagram, you'll see a traditional CMS. Basically, it's a web application that lets an editor edit content, and then it serves pages through a web server to a visitor on the internet. This is just how most websites work. A headless or detached or hybrid CMS allows you to decouple this. You can run the web application on one server and then basically host the results on an entirely different server. There's a few, and there's a REST API in between that connects the two of them. There's a few advantages to doing something like this. For example, there's a separation of concerns. There can be a significant performance gain, and it's also potentially more secure because the CMS itself doesn't even have to be connected to the internet while the pages are being served. Of course, it also has a bunch of disadvantages. It's a bit more work to set up, and making things interactive is also a bit more involved. So basically, you should make a well-informed decision if you decide to use something like this. If you want to do it, you can though, and I'm just going to briefly show you. If you go back to Bolt, one of the things we incorporated in Bolt is the API platform. API platform is a Symfony library that allows you to create APIs, and in this case the API exposes all the content of all our content types, all the content that's in the database as JSON to anybody who wants to consume it. For example, if I just go here and click the try out button, what you'll see here is basically, let's see if I can enlarge this a little bit. What you see here is a URL of the API endpoint, and this is the result of that API endpoint. It's just a bunch of JSON. So out of the box, Bolt allows you to create an API that consumes this JSON. So what you would normally want to do is create something like a static site generator that consumes this API and creates some pages. So what we can do for that is you can use a tool like Jekyll or Hugo. In this case, I'm using a tool called Gridsome, which basically does the same thing, only it's built on Vue, which I personally like. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to, first I'm going to show you the configuration of Gritsum, and there's one thing I want to point out is basically this Gritsum has a configuration, and in this configuration I basically tell it the endpoint of the API I want to use, and this is all I need to configure here. What Gritsum does is you can create GraphQL queries to query the database and do stuff with it depending on what you want to do. So if I go back to the command line and if I run Gritsum develop, then it will start up Gritsum in development mode. And one of the nice things it does is it also creates a GraphQL Explorer. If I open this in a database or in a browser, then on the left hand side you can see the GraphQL query that I'm using. And if I run this, then it will actually send this to the API endpoint and it will fetch the content that we want to use. This is basically the same content that we had in our website just now. So the next thing you want to do with this is actually use this to build a bunch of HTML pages. So what I can do is if I run Gritsum build, what it's going to do now is it's going to run through all the content in my site, fetch all the data from the API and create HTML pages out of that using the templates that were defined in Gritsum. So if I do a git status now, you will see that there's a lot of JSON and JavaScript and HTML files created. So basically these are flat files. They just work without having any special kind of server. What you can do is you can host this on, for example, GitHub pages or something like Netlify. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to shove all of this into Git. So now I've shoved all of this into Git, and what I've done is I've created a Netlify account, and what this Netlify account does is it looks to this repository, and every time it detects a change in the repository, it pulls in the files, puts it on a web server somewhere, and basically we can use that site. So now let's see if it worked. So I'm going to go to netlify.com. I'm going to log in, and I have the Bolt test that I've set up here before, and as you can see, it's published today at 8:55 p.m. and if I go there, we'll have a very boring website with all the content that we just pulled in from our API. So to summarize, what I've done is I've set up an API. We have an API endpoint. We set up a static site generator that consumes all the data from the API, writes it out as flat files. We shove it into Git, and then we publish it on a website. So now, without my computer where I actually built it having to be online, this is online and stays online. It's secure because there's no server component involved, and it's actually really easy to use. Okay. Well, that was basically the last thing I wanted to show for now. Let's go back to the presentation. Oh. It would be nice if my keynote would stop crashing. Okay, so that's the last thing I wanted to show for now. This was a short demonstration of the features we've been working on in Bolt 4. Hope I didn't overwhelm you by going over them in such a quick tempo. I do hope that my presentation piqued your interest in Bolt 4 and gives you an impression of where we're going and what we wish to achieve with it. And if you'd like to help out, of course, Bolt 4 is open source. You're very welcome to join us. The code is on GitHub. Before we get to the questions, these are my contact details. I'm quite active on Twitter. You can find me there. You can also send me an email. We have a website at boltcms.io, and there's of course a Slack channel where I'm also quite often. Finally, if you happen to be a PHP developer and looking for a new job, we're always looking for people, just as an aside. And so, does anybody have any questions, comments, snide remarks? Who wants a sticker? Roberto.
I was wondering, when you showed us the controller,
Yeah.
It was extending from a base controller.
Yes.
Is it really necessary, or can you create like really slim controllers?
Yeah, you can do whatever. So you're asking if you need to extend that base controller specifically? Well, you don't have to. If you want to have a controller that outputs something entirely different, like JSON or XML, just make a regular controller and output whatever you want. Just make sure that your controller returns a response object, and then you should be fine.
Cool.
Hey.
When is the release date for this?
You're asking what the release date is. Well, there's of course the roadmap, and earlier I was talking about all the downsides of doing a total refactoring. Basically, one of them being it always takes twice as long as you expect, and well, we found that to be true. But actually, at the moment, I'm aiming for a release in the first quarter of next year, and we're actually pretty well on schedule by making that. There might be some rough edges by then. There might be some features that people really want to have that are not incorporated yet, but we will have a stable release in the first quarter of next year.
As you presented, you already made a lot of CMSs.
Yes.
I can guess during the process you always find out new things, or you come across things you want to improve. So what are the main things you come across building Bolt 4, where you think of the version before, where you think, well, this was really shit, this is going to improve?
Yes, you're asking what the main takeaways are that the experience that we've gained by building CMSs before. Well, actually, perhaps the most important thing is not necessarily technological, because technology changes all the time. Over time, we get to be slightly less crappy developers. But one of the things that I've learned a lot about is actually thinking about what clients actually want and what they need, and how to make a tool that's user-friendly and something that actually people like using. And in my opinion, making something that's nice and easy to use is even more important than something that's technologically very advanced. Of course, like I mentioned, it has to be solid and maintainable, and so that you don't fall into the same traps as before, where it becomes harder and harder to maintain. But that's technological stuff. The important part is the users.
How the API connection? We saw the end URL, maybe I missed, but do you use a basic authentication, or how do you make it more simple?
In the API, we don't use any authentication yet, because right now it just exposes the content that is also presented on the website itself. This is using the API platform though, and if you're familiar with it, let me just quickly see if I can there's actually a lot of documentation about this. You can use authentication, either using Symfony authentication or JWT, or well, whatever. You can expand it however you like. And this is one of the things that we really want to do inside Bolt 4. Basically, we don't want to reinvent this ourselves. We don't want to build our own library for API or for creating JSON, because there's stuff like this that's already there. So what we do is we just put it in, we make sure that we incorporate it into the system and we expose it, and then if you want to do something with it that's not part of Bolt itself, you can easily expand it.
Another question, is there a marketplace out there? I mean, for every feature that I would like to build, I need to create an extension. For instance, I would like to include analytics, Google Analytics, GTM, actually.
So for Bolt 3, let me just... Where did it go?
I mean, do I need to get every time a developer involved in any new extension or somewhere?
Well, for Bolt 3 we had the marketplace, and basically we built it ourselves, and we had a bunch of extensions on there. For Bolt 4 we're going to tag along on the Packagist ecosystem, and basically if you create any Packagist or any GitHub repository that you put on Packagist, and if you give it a type Bolt extension, then it will be registered as a Bolt extension. So right now there's, because it's still beta, not a lot of them, but over time the most often or the most frequently used extensions will appear on here, like something to make simple forms with, or a contact form, or a Google Analytics thingy, or something, or a simple SEO extension, stuff like that. They will be on Packagist, and you can just pick them out here and install them using Composer.
And how difficult is to get from Bolt 3 to Bolt 4?
Yeah, basically you put your Bolt 3 install aside, set up a new Bolt 4, move over the templates if you want to keep the templates, and then you tweak the templates until they are what you how you want to have them. But because the structure between Silex and Symfony is so completely different, I don't think it's feasible that we actually make an upgrade from Bolt 3 to Bolt 4. The only thing we can do is help people to set up a new Bolt 4 installation and then help them copy over the parts that they need, like having a proper exporter and importer for your data. You can copy over your content types, your templates, but that's about it. So it will take some work to migrate from Bolt 3 to Bolt 4. In fact, I think with a lot of the websites that we are building at our company, we're not going to migrate all of them straight away. Basically, we're just going to, the ones that are running on Bolt 3, they are not broken once Bolt 4 comes out. So we're just going to leave them at that, and we're going to make sure that they stay updated and secure. And then whenever we're going to do major maintenance on a website or do a new version or a new layout, then we migrate to Bolt 4.
How easy is it to install Bolt in existing Symfony 4 project? Is it just Composer require, or do you have to?
Yeah, you can a Composer require Bolt/Bolt, and then you have all the Bolt specific code that you need. If you do it that way, you will have to manually set up the routes and set up a few services to make sure that it's usable, but it's pretty easy to do. So you can incorporate it into an existing Symfony 4 or soon Symfony 5 project.
The routes should be through recipes or something?
Yes, we can make them. We haven't done so yet, but if there's interest, we might look into that. It should be possible to make flex recipes for that. Yeah. Okay.
Can you just really quickly about asset management? How do you manage assets? For example, if I want to create a custom team or something like that.
Sorry, excuse me.
Asset management.
Yeah.
Like do you use something like Webpack and Core or some other?
For Bolt itself, we use Symfony Encore, which uses Webpack, but that's just to build the backend. For the front end, for basically the templates you create or the theme you create in your site, you can do whatever you want. If you want to use Webpack, you can use it. If you want to just drop in some bootstrap CSS files, you can do that. So basically, you can do whatever you want. You're on your own. If you do use Symfony Encore, of course, it will create the correct files, and you can use them with the asset tag inside your template. I think I can. Wait, let me. I think I can quickly show you actually what that looks like. For example, let me just close all of these. In the project we just created, we have the public, we have the theme, and there's the template we were using, and the index.twig. Oh, you can't see it at the top, but it extends the partials/master.twig. And if we go there, no, if we go to the master.twig, basically here you'll see that it just uses the regular Symfony asset tags. It uses the theme namespace, but you can, of course, use whatever you want.
The company I work for is always questioned by clients how they can maintain and create their own forms.
Yeah.
Is there a possibility, or is to support?
Not yet, but I think there will soon be an extension to create forms. Basically, of course, we have the Symfony Forms component in already, so it should be pretty straightforward to create an extension that allows you to define a form and just basically put it on the page and have it call back to a controller and just send out emails. That's the most often used use case for that, so that shouldn't be hard to add. We had it for Bolt 3, we used it all the time, and it will be there for Bolt 4 as well. Okay. I think that's it. Thank you for your attention.